Well, greetings, everybody. Welcome once again to the Rec Poker Podcast, officially sponsored by Running Aces Casino and Racetrack. I'm your host, Steve Fredland, and we are in the middle of a series on rebuilding my strategy from scratch. And so far, I guess the key learnings I've had from the first two parts are that, first of all, my default strategy is going to be GTO, and learning what optimal is under different situations. So different stack sizes, position, stage of tournament, opponent types, that sort of thing. What is GTO in those different situations? But whatever GTO is, I want to be intentionally looking for situations where opponents are playing suboptimally and then developing and utilizing counter strategies to exploit them. And for my standard pre-flop GTO ranges, for most of the tournaments I'm playing, I'm going to consider deep stack as having at least 50 big blinds. And so before we get into this week, I did have some additional conversations about GTO, kind of the theory behind it, what it is, with Kenna James and Jonathan Little. And Kenna said he is not thinking my strategy should be switching back and forth from GTO to exploitive unless I can really define how I'm going to switch back and forth, like how many big blinds at what stage of the tournament. And so as we discussed this more, I asked him to really define what he meant by GTO and exploitive, and he shared his definitions, and I thought it would be great to pass these along to you. He said that GTO is taking the optimum line of action given a set of circumstances that is mathematically unexploitable given your opponent acts logically and predictably. Numbers are your primary source of decision making. And he said exploitive is putting people as your primary source of decision making. Your opponent's biasness and tendencies, and reading those tells and exploiting those situations even if they go against the mathematical play of the situation. And as I talked to Jonathan, he asked, I asked if GTO adjusts for chip stack, stage of tournament, and opponent player types. He said GTO definitely accounts for stacks. It can account for ICM, think ICMizer, and can be adjusted to opponents' tendencies. He said this is called node locking in PioSolver, something I haven't heard of. So obviously it gets very, very deep from there. He also said that GTO to him means learning a baseline or optimal strategy and then adjusting to exploit as maximally as possible based on what we know. So I thought that was just some really good information. I'm starting to hone in a little bit more on what it practically means to be GTO versus exploitive. And I'll pass those insights along as I get them myself. So before we get further into this week's question, just a reminder, I just launched Patreon. It's a way that you can support what we're doing here at Rec Poker. I know a few of you. I want to appreciate Va Zhang and Brad Olson as our latest Patreon subscribers. Thanks to you guys. And this is just a way that you can say, man, thanks for providing the content, but also as we look to the future, look to maybe expand this and provide some additional free content and some other opportunities. The finances will be used for that. So if you want to be a part of the Patreon family, go to patreon.com/recpoker. Now today I do have a couple of questions that I'm blending into one, kind of a buy one, get one free, if you will, I guess. And here's the two questions. First of all, before I construct the actual hands that make up my hand ranges, I want to consider a couple of foundational things. First of all, should I have 10 different ranges for all 10 different possible opening ranges, or should I somehow group them and think about groups of hand ranges? And then secondly, assuming I have a deep stack, which for me I've defined as at least 50 effective big blinds, and I'm playing GTO, about what percentage of under-the-gun hands should I be opening? And we're going to really explore the actual hands later, but just in general, what percentage of hands should I be opening deep stack playing GTO? And so I'll start the feedback with the Twitter polls. And so in the first one, when I asked about how many opening hand ranges by position should we have, we had 60% of the folks categorize them as early, middle, late, and blind. So more than half of the folks that answered the Twitter poll said, they don't do something for all 10 positions. They categorize them and they use early, mid, late, and blinds. Now 26% said they use something different for all 10. And then the other people were either 2 to 3 groups or 6 to 7 groups. So it seems like about, a quarter to a third of our folks are probably using all 10, and half to 2/3 of our folks maybe 2/3 to 3/4 of our folks are using some kind of a grouping and generally early, mid, late, and blinds. And then when I asked the question about what percentage of hands should we be opening under the gun, not should be, but if you think about your range or if you think about what you normally would do kind of long term, what does that work out to be? And 44% of our folks said 11 to 15%. The next category was 16 to 20%. 30% of our folks said that. About a quarter of our folks said 6 to 10%, and 3% of our folks said 1 to 5%. So I guess, 75% of our people that were polled had at least 11%, with most of them being 11 to 15%. That sort of seemed to be the sweet spot, and then kind of centered around that, some less and some more. So with that, I want to hear from our pros that contributed. We had Mike Schneider from the Poker is Fun Tour, Jonathan Little from PokerCoaching.com, Hunter Sitchy from CheckShovePoker.com, Kenna James from KennaJames.com, and Jordan Young from the Solve for Why Academy. And first, I've just got some written feedback from a couple of them. And Jordan was just able to respond on Twitter. And when I asked him about, the percentage of hands that you open under the gun, he said it really depends on your post-flop ability. He said the less skilled you are post-flop, the tighter that you should play. So no real percentages there, but just sort of a general paradigm to keep in mind. So thanks for that, Jordan. And Hunter Sitchy said that he has unique opening ranges from each position at the table and modifies those ranges based on the size of the antes and the stack depth. And he went on to say that depending on the ante size, the stack depth, and the number of players at the table, your optimal under-the-gun opening range should never be tighter than 12% or wider than 16%. And he said that if you value his advice and you're interested in his poker coaching resources, you can learn more at checkshovepoker.com. So with that, let's hear the audio that was submitted.
Hi, this is Mike Schneider, founder of the Poker is Fun Tour and a member of the Minnesota Poker Hall of Fame. So yeah, when considering your opening ranges by position, you should be adjusting your range for every one of the 10 positions. But realistically, for simplistic sake, if you're at a 10-handed table, I do kind of just look at it as I'm under the gun +1. I'm going to be playing really, really tight. I'm not going to screw around much until I see table conditions dictate that I can start to open up my range a little bit. And by that, I'd want it to be a table where people aren't 3-betting that often, or people are playing way too tight, and there's a good chance that it's going to fold around to the big blind, or maybe there might be one cold caller. Or likewise, if there's tables where 6 or 7 guys are never pre-raising pre-flop, that might make me get in there with a few more hands, like 9-8 suited from under the gun in a 10-handed game. But yeah, I'm definitely not looking at it as purely under the gun, because under the gun 10-handed is a vastly different hand range than under the gun 7 or 6-handed. I am definitely thinking about it in terms of how far away from the button am I, since more players in the pot that get cards, the more likely somebody got dealt a strong hand. So just taking that all into consideration. But for a simplistic sake, on paper, or if we're playing game theory optimal, my range should look different from every single position. But in practice, my hijack range probably isn't too different from my cutoff range, and it just is just shades of looseness and tightness depending on how many hands have I played recently, what's my image, what are the guys around me, is there a guy acting right after me who just got aces cracked and is steaming and is going to be 3-betting really light. You try to take all those different variables into consideration to come up with a roughly shaped hand range that goes from really tight to a lot looser based on each singular position. But the reality is, they kind of are grouped from really early position, early mid position, late position, and the button. We're human. It's hard to in practice really say that every single spot I have a clear set of I do this in this spot but not in that spot. The game's a dynamic game where we're playing humans, and Like it's all based on like rough ranges where you do have some give and take in each spot based on particular table conditions and metagame and your personal image and the image of the guys around you. So I know I didn't really specifically answer, but I think that broad stroke of a paintbrush should give you my mindset of how I would approach the question. So until next time, you can find me on Twitter at Schneid's Poker, SCHNEIDS Poker, and the Poker is Fun Tour on Twitter at PIFT Poker, or you can find us on the internet at PIFTpoker.com. So until next time, thanks and good luck at the tables.
Hello, this is Jonathan Little of PokerCoaching.com. Today's question is about pre-flop opening ranges, and the question is, do you change them for each position? And then how do you group the positions? Well, I definitely suggest you understand that every position should play differently. Under the gun, 10-handed should play differently than under the gun, 9-handed, because you have fewer players yet to act. You should be playing pretty tightly in both situations. But I suppose if you wanted to try to make poker as simple as you possibly could, realize on the button, you need to be playing a lot of hands. In the cutoff, you need to be playing fewer hands. In the hijack seat, you need to be playing fewer hands. And in the low jack seat, you need to be playing fewer hands. Then, from all of the earlier positions, you can start playing pretty tight. Just because from, under the gun 7-handed to under the gun 10-handed, you really just cannot mess around much at all. And if you are playing too wide, you're just going to be spewing money all over the place if your opponents play well. If you play around with a lot of the Game Theory Optimal programs, you will find they actually suggest playing really tightly under the gun, like 9-handed. They'll say fold stuff like pocket eights and ace-10 suited and ace-jack suited and whatnot. But I don't think that's practical in most games that you're going to run into because most players just are not good, right? You're not playing against solid, strong Game Theory Optimal robots. You're playing against players who are going to have lots and lots of flaws, especially when you're playing these small and medium stakes. But if you do look at the very high stakes, like super high roller tournaments, you will find players just folding these hands from under the gun because they know how to play. That said, they know how to play, and they have sort of lobbied to make the game 8-handed or 7-handed or 6-handed because it's really boring to just sit there and know you don't get to play any hands from early position, and that does not create for a good game. You want to be playing hands. You don't want to just sit there and fold, but you are induced to fold because there are lots of players at the table and you have the worst position. So anyway, I am always thinking definitely low jack and later. That's under the gun 6-handed. You should have some sort of strong understanding of what a fundamentally solid range looks like from each of those positions. I discuss these in my book, Mastering Small Stakes No Limit Hold'em, and also at pokercoaching.com. So we definitely nail that down. In general, I do think you can play a little bit looser than most Game Theory Optimal strategies suggest, though, and that's usually how I go about doing it. If you really want to make life super easy on you, there's a program called Poker Strategy Equilab. If you just click on the default hand ranges for No Limit Hold'em, go there, click on their loose suggestions, and if you play roughly those ranges, you're not going to go too wrong. That said, I suggest you study, figure out what optimal ranges look like from all positions, and then make them slightly looser or slightly tighter depending on your opponents and their overall tendencies. What percentage of hands should we be playing from under the gun? Well, first question is, what is under the gun? Are we playing 9-handed? Are we playing 6-handed? I'm going to assume we're playing roughly 9-handed, and also that we have maybe 50-ish big blind stacks or more. You'll see some players who want to play like 15 to 20% of hands, and they just play all Broadway hands and all pairs. And doing that is a gigantic mistake because, well, Jack 10 offsuit and Queen 10 offsuit are terrible, right? So, from early position, what am I doing? I'm going to be playing about 8% of hands. I have the Float the Turn Range Analyzer, which is a program I made to help my students over at pokercoaching.com analyze their hands and, give me good homework answers, because if they say, I do this with X% of hands and something else with X% of hands, they probably don't even know what they're talking about. It's hard to think about poker in that manner. Anyway, I'm opening under the gun with about 8% of hands.
Hi, Steve. Kenna James here with Kenna James Poker and Life Coaching for a better balanced game and a more fulfilling experience, both on and off the felt. When considering your opening hand range by position, do you adjust your range for every one of the 10 positions? I don't. I think it's way too specific and gets way too detailed and I think you're going to lose too much. I group them more, like you say, by positions in general, especially for an opening hand range, which is what you're asking for. It's what hands I'm going to enter the pot with. And it's not just considered by position, but a lot has to do with my stack size and my strategy at the stage of the tournament that I'm in. That's what really dictates and flows my hand range. It's not a static set of range of hands, because everything is changing in a tournament, from table to table, from tournament to tournament, to round lengths, everything. So that has to be fluid, I find. So your range is also fluid, even your opening range. You may start with something, but it quickly changes based on your table makeup. Then going on to your next question, under the gun, what percentage of hands should you be targeting to open raise with? I'm going to say your range should be moderate, assuming you already have your release point, 10 to 15%. The important part is that it's balanced, a balanced range, and that's going to add another 3 to 5%. So we're looking at more like 18 to 20%, 10 to 15% core range, your top range of hands, and then a balancing range of another 3 to 5%. I hope these answers have been helpful in you building your strategy, and for your listeners there at home listening to improve their own game. I have great respect for students of the game and those studying to learn and improve and raise the level of their game. Enjoy the journey.
Okay, great stuff from our pros, as always. Before we hear from the recreational players, I just want to quick remind you that our sponsor is Running Aces, and last week was the Great Minnesota Poker Tournament, sort of a spoof on the Minnesota State Fair, which was going on, the Great Minnesota Get-Together. And a huge shout-out to Ramsey Stovall, who actually works at Running Aces and went on to win the tournament. He's a dealer there and had a great run and had just a fantastic final table and took it down. And I also want to give my congratulations to the rest of the final table, Matt Sundberg, Brady Roth, Saad Ghanem, Jerry Kangas, Matt Alexander, the great George Sanford, Ryan Hawkins, Mike Hohen, and Adam Frank. And the next big events that they have coming up are the Optimum with a big blind ante. That's a $300 buy-in on September 16th. And then the start of the Midwest Poker Classic, which runs throughout the second half of September. So go to runaces.com and check that out. Now, here's some of the feedback from the recreational players. First, I'll share some of the written feedback, and then we'll get to the audio. Mike Engelhop said, I group them early, mid, late, and blinds, and I have default ranges that I've gotten used to by using Poker Snowy. However, when I play tournaments, these ranges get used more often in early stages, and then I adjust when tournament gets into the middle or later stages based on stack sizes and blinds. And he said it probably works out to be about 8 to 10% that he would open under the gun. Now on Twitter, Adam, who goes by the handle PGA Pro Poker, says you can't predetermine how many hands you're going to play. I see no value in having a target percentage. And Steve Webb said, I would guess 5 to 10%. Now, Dave Margulis on Facebook says, I like to open from all positions with any raise-worthy hands, suited connectors, pairs, Broadway cards, with hopes to exploit players trying to exploit me later. I like to set the tone as an aggressor and hopefully trap someone down the line. Obviously, ace-king or pocket tens will play itself, but raising with 4 or 5 suited under the gun might frustrate some players and then have them chasing me, assuming I won and exposed that hand. As far as your GTO strategy and 50 big blinds under the gun, wouldn't this be more of a math thing that isn't malleable? 31 hands, 169 possible hands, so like 19%, and I'd be folding to a 3-bet 70% of the time later, which makes me sad. And that's why I play like a maniac. Thanks, Dave. Alberto Briones Moraz says, I don't have a set range with each position. It has more to do with my holdings in a given hand that will make me open. I use all positions to open if my holdings are strong, and if in late position, I do tend to open my range, but personally, I get so much action with my opens that I will open with any 2 cards, therefore balancing my range and keeping my opponents always guessing and unsure of what I have. I hope this helps. And Alberto also said, if I have 50 bigs, I will then only open with strong holdings, therefore reducing the percentage, but always looking to exploit spots where my reads or actions of my opponents will allow me to win pots. But I never think in terms of I have to be opening a certain amount of hands or percentage to be successful. I find that concepts like that tend to be flawed, since in the later stages of daily tournaments, in my opinion, it's more about adapting to the table dynamics and acting according to that. All right, thanks Alberto, thanks Dave, thanks all you guys. Now let's hear from the Rex who submitted audio.
This is Rob Washam for the Rec Poker Podcast. I tend to group my ranges by early, middle, late, and blinds. I don't try to break it down any further than that. I would open raise with a 10% range.
Hello, this is Steve Barton from the Heads Up Poker Podcast, and we are on to our next question. Hand ranges by position. Do you adjust your range for every one of the 10 positions, or just for categories, early, middle, late, and the blinds? I do it for every position, but I would recommend starting out, if you're really starting with opening ranges, group them into categories, early, middle, late, and the blinds, and you'll be able to kind of sort them easier. And as time goes on, you'll be able to dissect a little bit more exactly under the gun and exactly UTG 1, UTG 2, and like that. And you'll know that in the hijack, these are the hands that I'm going to open at this table, and these are the ones I'm going to fold. Okay, so I would recommend doing them by groups like that. Now, as far as like opening ranges and percentages, I'm pulling up my Hold'em Manager 2. I'm primarily an online player, and I look at online as like it's your practice area. You can try anything you want, and you have these programs that will track every single hand that you've played, and you can recall them with specific players. I have players on here that I have thousands of hands on, and I've dissected their game, and I know exactly how to beat them. This is the advantage to online, is the study aspect afterwards, is you can go back and you can really look up how often am I raising under the gun, and it'll tell you. Okay, so by position, in early position, I'm raising about 12%, and so early position would be UTG 1, UTG 2, and UTG. Around middle position, I'm up to 18%, cutoff 23%, the button 27%. And the small blind, 20, the big blind, 9. Now that's how often I'm raising in those spots. Playing cards in the spots, under the gun, 13.1. So the difference there is not even 1%. I'm very rarely limping under the gun. All right, I hope that helped. This has been Steve Barton with the Heads Up Poker Podcast. You can go to headsuppoker.poker if you want to listen to more, or find us on iTunes, Stitcher, Podbean. We're on all the outlets. Thank you for tuning in. Have a great rest of the day.
Hey, this is Matt Hamilton. This is my answer to question 3. So I generally, when I'm playing at a 10-handed table, have different pre-flop opening ranges. And they do vary slightly from position to position. I would say that early position, I would group as like under the gun 1, and I would use maybe the same opening range for both of those positions. And then the next 2 positions, I would say under the gun 2 and middle position, or MP1, I would kind of use the same opening ranges for those 2 positions. And then as we get into low jack, hijack, cutoff, and button, I would kind of like increase my opening range incrementally as it gets closer to the button. So like if I'm, first act under the gun 1, I have a pre-flop opening range for those 2 spots. Under the gun 2, middle position, I have a pre-flop range for those 2 spots. And then as we get to low jack, I have a different pre-flop range, hijack, another different pre-flop range, cutoff, button. And the closer we get to the button, the better our position is, the more I'm going to be opening. What percent of hands should I be targeting to open raise with under the gun with a comfortable stack? I would say my default range, if I don't know anyone at the table, if I just sat down, I'm going to be opening about 20% of hands under the gun. Now, this is assuming there's an ante. If there's not an ante, I'm cutting that in half. I think people play way too loose when there's no ante involved. So this would be like early on in a tournament, first few levels. People play way too loose. But let's assume there's an ante. I would say about 20% of the hands. So every pair, suited connectors, ace queen or better, ace 9 suited or better, ace 5 suited.
Under the gun strategy, John Somsky. As far as opening hand ranges by position, I like to follow the strategy outlined by Chris Fox Wallace in his books No Limits. Tight under the gun, then loosening up in each position after that, and in late position, I might take more liberties depending upon what the table will let me get away with. As far as under the gun opening range, that would be fairly tight for me, about 5% of my hands, which might be tighter than most players. Of course, depending upon tournament dynamics, sometimes you need to loosen that up a little bit, particularly if the table is folding a lot. But 5% would be about my starting point.
Hey, Rec Poker Podcast listeners, this is Derek Smith with feedback on the rebuilding of Steve Fredlund, the poker player. Like most people, I do kind of break it up as early, mid, and late, and then the blinds, but I do have a caveat, and that's just I really pay attention to both myself and other players that are either under the gun or on the button. I just think these two spots are so polarized, really, and they're the most scrutinized by even those players that aren't paying that much attention at the table. Mostly everyone knows that, at least generally, an under the gun raise is representing strength, and a button raise is often just considered BS. So I think you can exploit that thought by playing, a slightly wider range sometimes under the gun. And we'll get into that later. And then you can also work to not appear to be abusing the button and might be able to find a few more spots where you can steal from there, having great position. Of course, when you have monsters, occasionally it might look less like a steal and more like a real raise. And unfortunately, people might fold when you're on the button with a huge hand. But I think the value that you'll gain from being able to sneak some junk through is probably worth it. On to the fourth question. Opening range from under the gun, I think I'd lean towards about 10% to 17%. Chris Fox Wallace has a sevens plus that's kind of in line with 10%. It does include an ace jack and ace queen off. I don't think he would suggest playing those, but in 10%, you've got those sevens plus, ace 9 suited plus, king 10 suited plus, queen 10 suited plus, and then those offsuit aces again. 17% is something that I've seen Jonathan Little kind of suggest that includes twos plus and throws in ace 10 off, and then things like 10 9 9 8 8 7 7 6 6 5 suited. There's 36 hands to play at the 17% and 22 hands at the 10%. I think that in between 7% is where you can kind of work on being balanced, and you can utilize having that quote-unquote comfortable stack.
Greetings, Rec Poker players. This is Jerry Kniff contributing to the podcast. When considering opening hand ranges by position, rather than looking at all 10 positions, I usually divide them into early position, being under the gun to under the gun plus 2, mid, and then combining hijack and cutoff, button, and small blind. If I'm in early position with a comfortable stack range, again of 70 to 100 big blinds, I believe opening 10 to 15% in early position.
Hi, Rec Poker World. This is Stacy. I'm weighing in on the question Steve put out about opening hand raises by position. This is a pretty short answer for me. I need to just break it down into 3 groups: early, middle, and late. If I try to get too detailed with every position, my brain gets overwhelmed, and I think it has a negative effect. Whereas if I break it down to 3 areas, I can then make that adjustment on the go. So just knowing myself, that's where I'm at right now. I'm interested to know if it would really be beneficial to break it down per position. That's something I could grow into. But right now, early, middle, and late is kind of how I have them divided up. Steve, you asked some great questions that make people really dig into things to get their thinking straight on this kind of stuff. So I really love it. Just to start out with background on me, if you haven't heard me before, I'm somewhat new to the game, and so I feel like I'm just learning a lot of this stuff, and I feel very uncomfortable playing out of position, as many of us do. But that has caused me to really tighten up my under-the-gun opening range. And so the question is what's optimal, and I would guess optimal is a larger percentage of the hands than I'm willing to play. I've just, when I loosen up my range there, I've just not found them profitable. So I've tightened up to probably just probably close to 5 to 7% of hands. So pretty much just premium hands that I'm willing to open under the gun. I'm folding often Queen 10, even King Queen often. On a really active table, I will fold. I just haven't found a way to have it be profitable. So that's a background on me. So it's different than what's optimal compared to really what I'm playing.
Okay, thanks to all you guys. I looked up a couple of other things online, and I found that Ed Miller has about a 14% opening range that he actually looks at from the early positions all the way through the cutoff. So he doesn't really adjust his range until you hit the cutoff, and he's at 14% there. And then I looked at the Red Chip Poker website and some of the stuff that they talked about what to open raising pre-flop. And they show it by every spot, and he's showing that for under the gun, when you look at every spot, it's only about a 5% range. Pocket sevens and higher, ace queen suited, and ace king. And this is pretty consistent with what Chris Fox Wallace has said in his book, No Limits. Now, on the Red Chip Poker site, when they say let's group together under the gun +1, and under the gun +2, then it gets to an 8% opening range, which also is consistent with Fox. But it does say that at a passive table, then these three positions increase to 11%. And if you're at a passive table and very deep stacked, which isn't defined on the website, it's about 16% is where they go with that. So thanks to those guys for publishing that great information. So what do I do with this now? I think about all this information, and at some point I need to make pretty much a decision on how I want my strategy to be, at least my default. And so assuming I'm trying to play GTO and my range for opening under the gun is not reflecting anything exploitive, and also assuming that I and the players behind me all have around 50 big blinds or more, I could say that I want to play a different range due to my capability post-flop. So knowing that I don't have a great confidence in playing post-flop out of position, I might say I'm going to shrink that range down a bit. But at this point, as I'm trying to rebuild my strategy, I really want to think about what is the optimal opening range from a GTO basis, and then I want to then work on my post-flop game so I don't have that disadvantage. So I'm really going to be approaching this as what is the proper under-the-gun GTO opening range that I want to adopt for my game. And so as I thought about that and I think about some of the feedback that was given, I find a number of the concepts that were brought up extremely interesting. For me, because of the limited brain power that I have, and Stacy Nelson addressed this as well, I like the idea of grouping positions as early, and then I'll do middle, late, and blinds later. But at this stage in my career, with the tournaments that I'm playing, given my game and my mental capacity, I'm going to consider early positions as under the gun +1, and under the gun +2 for a 10-handed tournament. Now, for a 9-handed, this would just apply to under the gun and under the gun +1, and then for 8-handed, just under the gun. So basically, this range is looking at whenever I'm first to act or it's been folded to me, and there are still at least 7 people behind me left to act, including the button and the blinds. So that's early position for me. So in a 6-handed game, there wouldn't be this range. I'd have to go to the next level. But I also love the idea of just being super tight and having under the gun ranges of pocket sevens and higher, ace queen suited, ace king. And this is what I've been doing, and it does help me avoid a number of tough post-flop situations. But conversely, I'm currently not balanced with that range. It's always, those are all big hands. And I love what Kenna and others had to say about trying to make sure that you're balanced. And I also love the idea of board coverage that Mike Schneider brought up, making sure that we can cover and connect with a number of different flops. So as I think about that, I also think that it's appropriate to think of my GTO range as reflecting the aggressiveness and passiveness of the table. So kind of adjusting to how that table is playing. So with all of that said, for the tournaments that I play, I'm going to have my default early deep stack range be about 16% of hands, but then constrict that range if the table is more aggressive, with the bottom end of my opening range being 5% of hands. So even at a really aggressive table, I would still be opening 5% of the hands. At the most passive table, I'd be opening 16% of the hands, and then somewhere in between there based on how it's playing out. Now, again, remember, this is all deep stack situations. So as other situations arise, the GTO hands will be different. But deep stack, under the gun or early position, 5 to 16% of hands. And it's beyond the scope of this episode to really define what those hands are. I'm going to really dig in deep later. Once I've kind of locked this in, this could still change as we're addressing other things. But once we get these percentages locked in, then I'm going to come back and talk to the recs, talk to the pros, and say, okay, here's the range I want. What should they be? What hands should we include in those pre-flop opening ranges? But for now, this helps me just have some opening working numbers. And so that is it for today. I know there's a lot of ground that we covered, a lot of ground that we could have covered that hasn't. And we're going to continue doing this sort of step by step, brick by brick, block by block, trying to build up my strategy in this. So I appreciate all of the feedback in that. Thanks to Running Aces, great weekly tournaments, great staff. Check them out if you're in the area. Thanks to the Rec Pros, all those people giving feedback. Remember, on iTunes, like us, comment, rate us, review us, subscribe, tell others, get the word out. We're growing like crazy every month for the past, 8 months, 10 months. We've had increased numbers every month, which is great. Also, man, support us on Patreon. That would mean a ton to me personally. And just as we're trying to keep building this thing, I would appreciate that vote of confidence and the funds to be able to expand this. We have patches, both adhesive and so on. They're free. If you'll wear them, just let me know and I'll send them out to you. You can also get gear, hats, shirts, sweatshirts. That's all available at floptheworld.com/recpoker. And if you have any other feedback or topic suggestions or ideas, any comments at all, Facebook, Twitter, at RecPoker. We have the RecPoker Facebook group, or just email me, stevefredland@gmail.com. Hope this is helpful. It's helping me just think all of this stuff through. I still have probably more questions than answers, but hopefully you're enjoying this, and thanks for being along for the journey. And I'm excited to keep this going, and we will chat with you next week.